That was a beautifully eloquent evocation of what rural Ireland used to be like, and perhaps in some places still is. And I know it myself because my father came from the banks of the Shannon in County Clare, and I spent every summer of my childhood on a farm on the banks of the river, a beautiful place. But it was medieval Europe. And that's the interesting thing about it, that I had the privilege, as you probably did, of observing people living as they had lived for centuries in very simple dwellings, cooking over an open fire, as my grandmother did, getting water from a well, which was one of my tasks when I was a girl, having to go up the half a mile up the Boreen to get beautiful water, the nicest water I've ever drunk in my life from the well. A lot of extreme hard work, an ethos of self-sufficiency because there was quite severe poverty. And also the richness and diversity of the encounters that you described between your father and the people that he met when he went into town. When my grandfather went into Kilrush, which was the local town, he had exactly those encounters with people of the same various and rich occupations that you described, many of which are now gone. It's changed. We can't get that back. And that's one of the sadnesses, I suppose, of how
I think this is the dangerous thinking.
Mm.
It's not that we can get it back, but we can distill the essence of it and regenerate it in a new way.
Okay, I would certainly not argue with that, but I think it gives us serious pause for thought, as did your discussion about Civil War memories, which I have to say I would slightly disagree with you, because I've come across many people, both in my own family and other rural families, who never spoke of the Civil War, particularly if they had been active participants in it. And I think the trauma of the Civil War, and traumas may be an issue that we need to think about as underlying a lot of what's happened in this country, including, John, the whole issue of what the church did to women and children. And I know you gave a lovely and really funny account of your dad at Mass and ending up prone on the floor ready to be anointed a bishop. And there is definitely a very affectionate connection between a lot of Irish people in the Catholic Church, but there's also a very, very dark side. And I doubt if there's a family in the country that doesn't know a story about a child or a woman who suffered from that particular affliction imposed by a very vengeful church in league with a vengeful family system.
Yes, and it's vital to say all those things, but it's also important to say that this did not arise from a tabula rasa. It arose from a particular context in history, the famines.
Did. And I wouldn't argue with that. I think a lot of it has to do with the formation of what happened to Irish land, how late it happened, and the way it took place at the end of the 19th century. It's a discussion for another day. I'm going to try to see if we can get... I'm not saying we have strayed, because we haven't, from the topic of interest groups. I think all three of our panellists have given us loads of food for thought. But maybe just to have a quick discussion before we go to you, the audience, trying to synthesize some of this. We've looked at the whole business, as Sandra did, of social media. And John has referred to it, to the companies that run these things, who are worth billions and billions, that do not pay anything like, if any, taxation, and many of which are domiciled here in Ireland precisely to avoid taxation. That is a problem for us in a particular way, apart from the issues that you raised so eloquently, Sandra, about what can happen to people through these mechanisms, the formation of instant interest groups, if you like, that are often used to troll people, to game them, to torture them online. And while the examples you gave were beautifully ambiguous, and it's important that they are in a way, that you could say those women really should have thought about what they were doing, particularly the first two. The last I would have much less of a problem with. And the moronic response. But it's a huge, monstrous moronic response to what is originally a moronic, stupid thing to do. That is possible now in a way that was never possible before, and that has huge implications for individuals and for the capacity of those who join those flash interest groups to become other than they might. Yes. The virtues of decency and community and knowledgeability, and also recognition of who you are and people knowing who you are. The anonymity that prevails on in the social media sites can be really frightening. There is also, of course, the issue of how social media has influenced things like the Arab Spring, not necessarily for the better. You know, that there was a kind of trope at a certain time that without Facebook, Tahrir Square would never have been full. Some of that may be true. The outcomes of a lot of those revolutions, except perhaps in Tunisia, have been pretty disastrous for most of the citizens of those countries. So lots of issues there. From our point of view in Ireland, we have an issue with Facebook and Google and possibly Instagram, I can't remember, being domiciled here in Ireland, evading tax egregiously, as has now been proven without any doubt, and now forbidden to transfer some of their data to the United States, where it may be used for surveillance purposes, as revealed by Edward Snowden. So that's our issue, and no one's saying much about it. I know it's a very recent judgment, but it's a very important issue for our government and for our citizens to face up to, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. Helen, you were looking in great forensic detail at the lobbying legislation, the whole business of provision for public participation, the stakeholder consultation, the enormous breadth of fantastic new jargon that has crept into the Irish public service. Every time something goes wrong in a hospital, you get a statement from the HSE saying they are working with the hospital. If I hear that again, like, don't work with them, do it. Just get the thing done, whatever it is. But it's constantly we are working with. There's a language of American management speak that has crept into Ireland now that is taking over the public service, largely through performance management development systems. So out of date, it's unbelievable, invented in 1905 in the United States. They've long done with it, and we're spending a fortune trying to implement it here. That creeps into all of this, and it leads to cynicism, I think. And one of the implications of what you were saying was that all of this new laudable legislation has to be implemented by people who believe in it, and has to be participated in by people who believe in it. And that culture, I think, is really not there in the way that it might be. The whole business of citizen participation in matters that affect their localities, their future, their children, the education system, and so on. And people are seeing through this that you can have all the participation in the world you want and find that nothing results. Our tribunals are a case in point. Another, if you like, robust or should theoretically robust system that allows us to deal with lobbying groups like the beef industry. Who went to jail over beef? Nobody. So we end up after spending a fortune of money on this, and there's nothing to happen. Larry Goodman thrives. By the way, there's no piece of paper, and I wish there were. It's part of the loss of our digital record. If someone was able to find an email from Albert Reynolds to Larry Goodman saying, let's meet for lunch on such a day, it would have made a hell of a difference to the Beef Tribunal. But it's gone if it ever existed. I'm sure it probably was somewhere. So there's all of that. There are issues then about cynicism with regard to public regulation of interest groups. Can we buy that back? We do create, of course, new interest groups all the time. The anti-water campaign, with which I happen to disagree, has been a gigantic new interest group created almost ab initio by people who do not want to pay for their water. We're not going to get into that discussion because it could lead us into a very nasty situation.
But can I just say,
but there it is.
With that, though, I mean, I don't want to get into the water wars, but what astonished me when they started with the water thing was that the government did not start, first of all, with explaining the reasons why it would be good to pay for water, or even just doing a very quick little historical analysis of how recent it was that running water came into people's houses. I mean, there are some houses in rural County Kerry where water inside in the house didn't come until the mid-1980s. Yeah. That's, that is not that long ago.
Well, I mean, I myself observed the move from the well to the pump in the yard to the sink, yes, and the arrival of the sink in the kitchen and bathrooms was a gigantic change. But you're quite right, we didn't get that historic analysis.
Leaving aside all of the war with the water, is that in a way was a failure of the policymakers to not go out and do a bit of research, a bit of contextualization, before they came with this to the public. And there was no sense in which they were, going to explain, they were, after it came in, then they start doing the explaining, but then you're on the back foot.
Yes.
So I just think that goes back to what I was saying, is that there is more and more a fear of taking responsibility. That seems to be, and in local government certainly there is a move towards very much a sense of taking collective decision making and collective responsibility. Now you could say, that's fine because county managers in the past were always accused of having the power of God Almighty. Now they didn't. Of course, they behaved as if they had the power of God Almighty, but they didn't necessarily have it. But now it's it's very collective. So any plan or program or policy that goes, potentially can go through 4 different policy groups within the local authority. And, the life gets kicked out of it then.
But this is what I'm talking about, the obfuscation that has crept into what could be quite simple processes, where you work out what needs to happen and you try to implement it with as much consensus as possible. You don't have to do all that stuff to make that happen. And you're perfectly right, Irish Water really is a disgrace and has not done what it was supposed to do in terms of explaining to the population in an adult, mature way why it's necessary to, first of all, to have a central water authority, which of course was resisted violently by the local authorities who wanted to keep things the way they were. Anyway, that's for another day.
Katrina,
John, then, Sandra, of course.
I just to jump in on that, and it's not about the substantive issue as well, for fear we would be here all day, but something that we're looking at in the National Library about Irish Water right now. So you would recognise that this is a part of our history, like this discussion and however you would describe it. It's a thing that will be of interest to historians in the future. It's a part of Irish history now. But this is largely lived out digitally, so it's websites and, it's born digital content and ephemera that will be gone, and gone very quickly as well.
So you're going to save it in the library?
Yeah, so this is the conversation we're having at the minute, because we do save themes, topics from web conversation. So if there were an election in the next month or next year, we would save all those websites, because generally they vanish immediately after the election and they're gone. That's the end. The record is gone. But we want to save something about Irish Water, some of the discussion. Realise that it's extremely difficult to do that, because we have no legislation that allows us, that gives us the right to save it for the country, for historians and so on. And so we have to ask permission for anything we save like that. It's an opt-in process. And because this is so contentious, this is the one I think that gives a good example of something we will definitely have a very incomplete record of that discussion.
And something that's changing all the time. And that's part of the whole digital framework now, that things do change all the time. Great, that's really good news to hear, Sandra, and wonderful that the library is taking that on. And I hope you'll be able to do it for many other issues like this that will otherwise vanish, and it'll be hard to recapture what happened. Just to finish up before I go to the audience and let them interrogate the three of you, I think John raised a lot of very interesting issues, as well as giving us that eloquent account of his childhood in the Irish country, which is something that, as I said, I share with him. He made the point that the 14th Amendment to the American Constitution, which was the amendment to the Constitution that was supposed to give slaves freedom, has been interpreted to give corporations the same rights as human beings, which is an astonishing turnabout. And it's something that is not reflected on half as much as it should be. One of the biggest threats, not just to us in Ireland, but to everywhere, is multinational corporations with absolutely untrammeled power. In an increasingly globalised world, they are the interest group that most threaten citizens' rights, in my view, through things like John specified the pharmaceutical industry and the chemical industry. Pharmaceuticals have a vested interest in creating drugs, and of course some of them do create drugs that have had miraculous results for people in terms of physical illness. And I'm not as expert as you are, and I certainly intend to read Terry Lynch's book, but I certainly know people who have been helped through crippling depression by short-term use of medication. And I think the issue, that the debate that goes on now in psychiatry is between the talking cure, as it were, which involves big investment in someone who may be suffering, and it may just be sadness, it may be more. Who knows what schizophrenia is? We don't. R.D. Laing thought he'd worked it out, and it didn't come down in the end. But you're looking at an industry which makes billions every year on the back of producing medicines, some of which, as we know, have turned out to be incredibly dangerous, like Seroxat, the most popular antidepressant of the 1980s, which eventually had to be withdrawn from the market because of the demonstrated dreadful side effects that it had. And there are many more like that. So I suppose we need to think about what interest groups in Ireland have an effect. We know about the banks. We know about the Confederation of Irish Industry. We know about the Irish Farmers Association. We know about the GAA. We know about all kinds of benign as well as malign interest groups. How do we make sure besides what we were told by Helen, that we can control all of this, give people a legitimate and adequate voice to express things that matter to them without allowing vested interests to take over and get more than they're worth. Did you want to say something, John?
Well, I did. I mean, I think the most vital thing is the right to a conversation, and this has been actually taken away from us now, very gradually, but nevertheless assertively. Whereby interest groups, there's a kind of interworking of different ideological and corporate and cultural forces which result in silencing of people. For example, in the context that you talk about. I mean, of course there's a discussion and a debate to be had between Terry Lynch and whoever. And also there's one to be had between me and whomever about my emotion, my emotional life, what I experience, what I make of it, what words I seek to apply to it. Do I take an ideological word like depression and say I have that and that's the end of everything? I don't believe that that's an appropriate way for any human being to deal with themselves, because that word is one which has been taken. There are lots of things that are depressed, or you can have depressions in roles, you can have a depression in your soul. Whether that's a biochemical condition is a big, big question. And we have a right as human beings to speak back and not be bullied. And this is the thing, that we are now in a culture of absolute bullying all the time. We saw that in the referendum campaign, where you have 99% of the media on one side, you have 99% of the parliament on the same side, you have the government on the same side, you have the multinational corporations, you have a former president, you have the Garda Síochána coming out on the same side, and there are a handful of people seeking to assert a different view, a reasonable view, and a view that is entitled to be heard, which is vital, that it should be heard, because otherwise
they
you
were
cannot
heard, John.
No, they weren't.
You got equal time on TV and print. You did get equal time.
Well, we got equal time in a certain sense.
Some would have said very disproportionate to your numbers.
Well, we got.
In other words, a small interest group.
Well, no,
very small in terms of what the polls told us.
How do you decide in advance what is proportionate when you haven't yet put the question to the people to decide? How can you say that any side, it's only retrospectively that you can say that there was a disproportionality, and then it's too late to say so.
You can make certain assumptions based on fairly accurate opinion polls.
No, you can't, because opinion polls are not.
They didn't work in Britain at the last general election.
They're not an electoral instrument, and that's one of the fundamental mistakes we're making in our democracy. We're actually preempting the democratic process by, first of all, forecasting, and then asserting what the forecast tells us through megaphones owned by corporate forces, which have vested interest in the outcome. So we need to look closely at all of these things and ask ourselves: can we have in future any possibility of a calm, neutral discussion on anything that is not affected and contaminated by these forces? I don't believe we can at the moment, and we need to look at that. So that's my point, that there is all of these things. That's why I chose the chemical and IT and of course the financial forces as well, the banking forces. A wonderful book here, American book, Shop Class as Soulcraft, which touches on some of the things I was talking about, the idea of having the autonomy over your own craft and your own skills, and selling those in the marketplace, and the humanity that arises out of that, as compared to the cubicle or the treadmill that is now our lot. There are many things in this book, but banking is one of them, and one of the things he says about this is really interesting. Matthew Crawford is the author's name. He's a philosopher and a mechanic.
You're getting two books today now that you have to go out and buy and read.
A wonderful combination, a philosopher and a mechanic, and he writes eloquently on both subjects. But he talks about the banking, that once my wife used to be a banker and she gave it up in disgust because this had happened to it. That whereas previously it was a person based on personal relationship, just assessing on the qualities of the person, what you could find out about the person just walking around the street, talking to people. Is Katrina a good person? Is she a solid person? Is she reliable? Yes, she is, and so on. Now, it doesn't matter because it's all about selling off the loans anyway. And that's what happened fundamentally. So we talk about these things and we start personalising them about Sean Fitzpatrick or somebody and accusing a symptom instead of getting underneath the discussion, because there's no point.
In my defence and in the defence of others who mentioned him, he's become a symbol of all the things that you're discussing.
Because he is not the problem.
Now, I'm in trouble with time.